I used to think that home was the one place on earth where you could finally exhale, a sanctuary where the world's noise just faded away the moment you pulled into your driveway. But man, was I wrong, because for 6 months, my driveway wasn't an Oppos. TA's sanctuary, it was a battleground, and the person holding me hostage wasn't an Oppos. Some career criminal, but a 20-something kid named Colton and his silver Porsche 911. You see, I live in this quiet, leafy suburb in the Pacific Northwest where people obsess over their lawns and everyone knows everyone in Oppos. Business, and for years it was peaceful until the house next door sold to a woman named Diane, a woman who carried herself like she'd personally invented the concept of homeowner associations. Diane was a high-level real estate developer with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and her son, Colton, was basically the human embodiment of a participation trophy that had been dipped in gold and taught to sneer. It started small, just a couple of inches of his bumper hanging over into my entrance, and I did the neighborly thing. I really did. I'd wave him down and say, "Hey man, it's a tight squeeze, do you mind pulling up a bit?" And he'd just stare at me through those designer sunglasses, not saying a word before revving that engine and walking inside. But then small turned into deliberate and before I knew it, that silver Porsche was parked dead center across my driveway entrance every single morning, like a shiny German-engineered middle finger aimed directly at my life. I remember this one Tuesday, the kind of day that determines whether you're going to be able to pay your mortgage or not, because I had a final round presentation for a project I've been chasing for nearly 2 years. It was a massive urban redevelopment plan, the kind of career-defining contract that puts you on the map. I was up at 4:30 a.m., double-checking my renderings. My suit was pressed, my coffee was black, and I felt like I could conquer the world. But when I opened my garage door at 6:45, my heart just sank into my shoes, because there it was, the Porsche, parked so perfectly perpendicular to my driveway that I couldn't in Oppos fit a bicycle past it, let alone my SUV. I didn't Oppos panic, not at first. I just walked over to Diane's house and rang the bell. Then I rang it again, and finally, Diane opened the door wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my first car, looking at me like I was a solicitor trying to sell her cheap windows. I explained the situation, my voice trembling just a little with the urgency of the meeting, and I told her "Diane, I have to leave right now. Colton's car is blocking me in again," and she just leaned against the doorframe, checked her nails, and said, "Oh, Caleb, Don and Oppos. TB's so high-strung, the street cleaners were coming through, and he didn't into Oppos. On the car to get dusty. Surely you can just take a car service and be a little flexible for once." I stood there, absolutely floored, watching Colton wander in the hallway behind her, tossing his car keys in the air and catching them with his smug, punchable grin, and he just looked at me and said, "Yeah, chill out, old man, it's just a car. Maybe if you work harder you'd have one worth protecting too." I ended up waiting 40 minutes for a premium Uber because it was rush hour, and by the time I walked into that boardroom, the air was already cold, the clients were looking at their watches, and I had missed the opening 10 minutes of the presentation where the foundation of the whole pitch was laid out. I lost the contract, a deal that would have brought in nearly $300,000 over the next year. And I came home that night feeling like a ghost, just sitting in my dark living room, staring out the window at that Porsche, which was still there, gleaming under the streetlights like it was mocking me. I tried to go through the proper channels because I'm a believer in the system, or at least I was, so I called the local precinct. But the officer who showed up just sighed and told me that since the car was technically on my private property and not the public street, his hands were tied unless I wanted to pay for a private tow, which sounds easy until you realize that in our town, the towing companies wanted Oppos. Touch a luxury vehicle on private property without a signed indemnity waiver that basically makes you liable for any scratch on a $100,000 car. Then I went to the HOA, thinking they'd back me up, but it turns out Diane had spent the last 3 months donating to the Neighborhood Beautification Fund and had essentially bought the loyalty of the board president, a guy named Miller, who looked me in the eye and said, "Caleb, we need to foster a spirit of community here. Maybe try bringing them some cookies instead of filing formal grievances." That was the moment the good neighbor and me died, and something else, something much more calculated, took over because I realized that as long as I played by their rules, I was going to lose everything. My job, my sanity, and my home. I started documenting everything, and I mean everything. I bought a high-definition 4K camera system and hidden it in the eaves of my porch, recording every time that car crossed the property line, every time Colton laughed when he saw me waiting for an Uber, and every time Diane stood on her porch and watched me struggle. I spent weeks in the basement of the county records office, digging through old municipal codes and property easements, looking for anything. And that's when I found the, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, a forgotten 1970s ordinance regarding, end quote, unauthorized commercial encroachment and abandonment, end quote, that was originally designed to stop old car dealerships from dumping inventory on residential lots. The law stated that if a vehicle remained stationary on private residential property for more than 120 consecutive hours without a written lease agreement, and the property owner had issued a, end quote, notice of intent to impound, end quote, via certified mail, the vehicle could be declared, end quote, de facto abandoned, end quote, and the property owner could assume temporary legal custody to, end quote, mitigate financial hardship, end quote. The stars aligned when I overheard Diane and Colton talking in their driveway about a trip to Cabo for Colton's birthday. They were going to be gone for an entire week. The moment their airport shuttle pulled away, the clock started ticking, and I didn't in oppos. T-ways the second, I sent the certified letter to their empty house, knowing it would sit in their mailbox, and I posted a physical copy of the notice on my own garage door, hidden behind a decorative wreath, so it was technically, end quote, visible, end quote, but not obvious. For 5 days, I didn't in oppos. To use my car, I took the bus, I walked, I made sure that Porsche stayed exactly where it was, unmoving, while my cameras recorded the silence of the neighborhood. On the 6th morning, at 2 a.m., I wasn't oppos. T just a disgruntled neighbor anymore. I was a man with a legal mandate, and I didn't in oppos. T call a standard tow truck. Instead, I called an industrial salvage and recovery firm from the next county over, a crew that specialized in heavy-duty machinery and didn't into oppos. T care about the HOA's local politics. I showed the driver my stack of paperwork, the property deed, the 120-hour timestamp video logs, the unclaimed certified mail receipt, and the specific municipal code, and I told him, end quote, this vehicle is now considered an abandoned obstruction causing active financial loss. I need it moved to a secure, long-term storage facility in the industrial district, and I want the end oppos. Obstruction removal and oppos. Fees billed directly to the vehicle and oppos. SVN, end quote. Watching that Porsche get hoisted into the air was the most religious experience of my life. The way the moonlight hit the silver paint as it was dragged away from my driveway, leaving nothing but a few faint tire marks on the concrete. But I wasn't oppos. T done, because per the ordinance, once I had, end quote, custody, end quote, of the abandoned property, I had the right to file a, end quote, lien for loss of use, end quote, against the owner. So I calculated every single Uber receipt, the projected loss from the contract I missed, the cost of the legal consultations, and the stress-induced medical bills, totaling nearly $45,000. When Diane and Colton returned from Cabo, bronzed and smelling like expensive tequila, they pulled into their driveway and just stopped, staring at the empty space where their pride and joy used to be. And for the first time, I was the one standing on my porch, sipping a coffee, looking down at them. Colton came charging over, face turning a shade of purple I didn't know was possible, screaming about how he was going to have me arrested for grand theft auto, and Diane was right behind him, shrieking about her, end quote, connections, end quote, and how she was going to, end quote, ruin my life, end quote. I didn't in oppos. TL, I didn't in oppos. To even raise my voice, I just handed them a manila envelope containing the impound receipt, the address of the salvage yard, which, by the way, was a gated gravel lot surrounded by barbed wire and angry Dobermans, and a copy of the $45,000 lien. I told them, end quote, the car ISN and oppos, T stolen, it was legally processed as abandoned property, and if you want it back, you'll need to settle the storage fees and the lien in full before the yard auctions it off in 30 days, end quote. The fallout was nuclear. Diane tried to use her brother-in-law, who was a junior prosecutor, to intimidate me. But when my lawyer showed them the 4K footage of Colton literally mocking me while blocking my exit, and the ironclad paperwork following the 1970s. Ordinance to the letter, the prosecutor told her to just pay the money because I had, in quote, outlawyered, in quote, them. The HOA tried to intervene, but I walked into the next board meeting with a, in quote, cease and desist, in quote, against the board president for conflict of interest, citing his undisclosed financial ties to Diane's real estate firm. And suddenly, everyone was very, very quiet. Colton eventually got his car back, but it wasn't into Oppo's. The same. It had sat in a dusty, salty industrial lot for 3 weeks, and the, end quote, recovery fees, end quote, plus the settlement he had to pay me cost more than a brand new SUV. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted after that. The, end quote, power couple, end quote, image they had cultivated was shattered, and the other neighbors, people like the elderly couple across the street who Colton had also bullied, started coming over to my house with pies and bottles of wine, thanking me for finally sticking a spoke in their wheels. About 2 months later, a, in quote, for sale, in quote, sign went up in Diane's yard. They couldn't into Oppo's. Handle the, in quote, hostile environment, in quote, they'd created, and they moved to some gated community where I'm sure they're currently making someone else in Oppo's life miserable. But now, when I wake up and open my garage door, all I see is the open road and the quiet morning sun. And it reminds me that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully ISN and Oppo's, to hit them, but to let the weight of their own arrogance crush them under the letter of the law. It's been a year, and I still have that 4K footage of the car being towed, saved on a hard drive. I don Oppo's. Watch it often, but on the days when I feel like the little guy is getting stepped on, I click play and remember that justice might be slow, and it might be buried in a dusty law book, but man, it is sweet when it finally arrives. But I have to wonder, did I go too far? Some people in my life say I should have just kept trying to be the bigger person, that the, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, was too vindictive and that I could have settled it with a simpler lawsuit. But then I think about that 6-figure contract and the way Colton smirked at me, and I feel like I did exactly what needed to be done. What would you have done if your livelihood was on the line and no one was coming to help? Is there a point where, in quote, being the bigger person, in quote, just becomes, in quote, being a doormat, in quote, or did I become the very thing I hated just to get my driveway back? Drop a comment and tell me if I'm the hero of this story or just a very patient villain.